Hello everyone, here we are again. Today we're going to be talking about the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. And when we start looking at theologians and philosophers, it can be very challenging to understand what they're saying, especially if you look at this piece was written 750 years ago, and the language has changed since then. And so it's going to be a little challenging as you read it to understand exactly what they're saying. So hopefully I'll be able to break it down a little bit for you. But it talks about whether God exists, and that's what we've been talking about a little bit just recently. And there's two objections that Aquinas wants to look at and that people use to say that God does not exist. And the first one says this: it seems that God does not exist, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. And again, basically that's just saying there can't be two different things that are opposing each other. So if there's evil in the world and God is good, then God can't exist. The second objection is this: further, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God exists. And again, basically just that if we can say there's natural laws, then everything falls under that, or human reasoning and thought, and that's the other thing, so there's no need for God. But Thomas Aquinas says there is a God, and he goes through with 5 different points to show and object to these. And the first argument that he says in trying to prove that there is a God is the argument from motion. He says some things are in motion, and whether they're in motion, they had to be put in motion by something. You have potential motion and actual motion. You have a ball that's just sitting there. It has the potential to move. But if somebody kicks it or somebody does something to it, the ball is moving. There had to be some force, some object, some person or thing to cause it to be in motion. For example, with fire and wood. You can have a big pile of wood and has the potential for fire, but there's not an actual fire until there's some type of accelerant or some type of cause that causes that wood to start burning. And ultimately, he goes on to say that nothing can be both the mover and the moved. Basically, nothing can move itself. And so, if nothing can move itself, there has to be a first mover, something that originally moved and causes everything to move. And according to Aquinas, he says, the thing that puts other things in motion is God. The next point he makes is that the nature of the efficient cause. And this goes back to the first cause that we talked about a little bit. It says that all things were caused by something else. Can a tree grow backwards? No. Can you trace something backwards? No. So we must come to the conclusion that there is a first cause. And that first cause is God. And we talked about that in a little more detail before. The other thing he talks about, the third point, is from possibility and necessity. He says that some things are possible to be or not to be. So if something is possible not to be, so then it could be nothing. We don't need it, it's not necessary, so it doesn't matter. But there's also some things that are necessary and must be. And so if there's something that is necessary and absolutely has to be, then there has to have been a cause. Again, it goes back to that cause. And ultimately, if it's necessary, then that relates back to God. His fourth point is this: the gradation to be found in things, the different steps to be found in things, is very similar to the first cause thing. If it compares hotter than or colder than, the truer, the better, the best, the noblest, etc. He also, again, uses the example of a fire. If the fire is there and it's causing other things to be warmed up or heated up or burned even, that they wouldn't happen without that first cause of the fire. And so he wants to trace everything back. It says, therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their first being. And he says that's God. Then you have the governance of the world. It says natural bodies act for an end, and act in the same way for the best results. And they do so by design. The laws of nature are designed and continue to act in the same way. And without intelligence, they cannot be made that way unless directed on a being with knowledge and intelligence. And they cause that intelligence God. And so this is just a little excerpt that you read for this work. And you know, his work is much more detailed. Like I said, sometimes it can be confusing. But ultimately, he goes back at the very end on page 13 on your book and says, you know, you talked about your objection 1, that evil and good couldn't exist in the same thing. And this is his reply. He says, as Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. And then his reply to the second objection. He says, since nature works for a determinate end under the direction of a higher agent, whatever is done by nature must needs be traced back to God as its first cause. So also whatever is done voluntarily must also be traced back to some higher cause other than human reason or will, since these can change and fail. For all things that are changeable and capable of defect must be traced back to an immovable and self-necessary first principle, as was shown in the body of the article. Ultimately, Aquinas says, good and evil can exist, even though God is only good, because he can make things good out of evil, and refutes that. He then also says, yes, there's laws of nature, yes, there's human reasoning, but human reasoning can fail. Laws of nature are so precise and don't change that they had to have been started by some type of intelligent design, and all that is God. And therefore, God does exist, and these are all good things for us to know and look at, so that if we are asked the same questions, we can be able to figure it out and explain it to other people.